in international climate negotiations, but also how is it that you bring that down to the local level, things that we are contemplating doing, the kinds of things that we're contemplating doing here in Concord in terms of making a very ambitious goal of saying we want to be 100% renewable energy by 2050. What are the elements that you really need to pay attention to make that real? How is it that you can make the sort of spirit of the Paris goals and international agreement applicable to the local level? So that's one of the things we'll be talking about tonight. The other thing that I think that even in this age of inaction and, in my view, retrenchment out of Washington on a lot of these issues, there's an awful lot of things that are happening around the country on the state level and local level that I bring a lot of optimism to, and hope actually, and draw from that. I think there's a lot of folks who are taking actions into their own hands and taking their destinies into their own hands, whether it's on the state level or municipal level across the country, to be a reason for optimism. Ed Cameron is somebody who has a wide variety of experience. He has worked internationally, as I said, for more than 20 years. He's a consultant at this time in his life, but he had worked for a variety of organizations, including the World Bank. And he's here tonight to talk about his experience and then again how we might bring that to our own local level and how we might make climate change action real and actionable and take action here at the local level. So I want to introduce Ed without any other delay. Thank you very much.
Everybody, and let me echo the comments from a moment ago in thanking you for coming out on a Tuesday evening to participate in what I hope will be a very rich conversation. What I'm going to try to do initially is to seed that conversation with this particular presentation, but I would very much encourage everybody to raise your voice as part of this discussion. It's going to be very important for us to converse about this issue. I find that much of the richness of these types of events comes from the back and forth between your comments, your questions, my response, and the response of the people sitting as your neighbours in the room. So let's try and make this as interactive as possible. Please, at any point during the presentation, feel free to raise your hand if you feel that something is lacking in clarity. If you want to make a particular comment, I will try to deal with it. Otherwise, we will take all of the comments and questions towards the end. Now, as mentioned, I have worked on the issue of climate change for over 2 decades. I'm very blessed, I believe, in my life because most people are lucky if they have a job. You become very successful if you turn that job into a career, and I've managed to turn a career into a vocation, something that gives me a sense of purpose, something that makes me get up every morning feeling enthused and excited because I feel as if the work that I do is contributing to building pathways for prosperity and particularly serving the most vulnerable people around the globe. So for those 2 decades, I've worked with developing countries, with least developed countries, with prosperous industrialized countries, and across different scales of governance, from the international to the regional to the national and down, of course, to the local and municipal. Essentially what I do as part of my career is I design strategies for companies to help them reduce their greenhouse gases and to help them build resilience into their supply chains. And I help to shape policies, the types of policies that governments put into place that catalyze low-carbon, climate-resilient development. So what I'm going to try to do this evening is share with you some of the lessons I've learned over the course of the last 2 decades in conducting that work. We're going to get political this evening at a certain point, so I want to warn you about that in advance. We're going to start the presentation by giving you an introduction to the Paris Agreement. That was the landmark international deal that was struck in the French capital in December of 2015 after close to 25 years of painstaking negotiations through the United Nations system. So I'm going to give you a sense as to what that agreement says, who participates in it, and what it means for us going forward. Then I'm going to change course slightly and give you a sense as to what is happening in Washington, D.C. under the new administration and how we must think about the new administration's approach to climate change in a variety of different scenarios and over a variety of different timescales. What I then want to do is to give you a vision for what new climate leadership is beginning to look like, looking beyond Washington and particularly examining the work that's being conducted in the private sector, with major corporations that will be familiar to all of you, beginning to fill this vacuum and beginning to demonstrate real leadership with substantial impacts. And then finally, I'm going to try to bring those lessons back down to the local level and give some strategic guidance as to what a solid municipal strategy that would be Paris compliant looks like. I'm not going into tactical details. I'm going to very specifically stick to the strategy as a springboard to the conversation that we might have subsequently. Now, to begin, to make sure that we're all on the same page, I want to very briefly make sure that we have a common understanding of what we're dealing with when we talk about the issue of climate change. And I know there's some people in the room who've heard this before, so apologies in advance for repeating. I always like to describe climate change as consisting of 3 collision courses. The first collision course is the production of pollution and how that changes the composition of our atmosphere. So for 10,000 years, ever since the dawn of settled human civilization and the way in which we began to shift land use and agricultural patterns, we have been altering the climate system through the production of human-induced greenhouse gas emissions. These are a variety of greenhouse gases, not just carbon dioxide, but other greenhouse gases, for example, including methane. And over the course of the last 150 years, since the Industrial Revolution, the quantity of greenhouse gas pollution that we've been sending into the atmosphere is unprecedented, to the extent that today the chemical composition of the atmosphere is unlike anything we've seen in the last 800,000 to 1 million years. And that is human-induced pollution. That is not natural cycles, that is not solar activity, that is not tectonic activity, that is not the result of volcanic activity, that is greenhouse gases produced by energy, transportation, land use patterns, industrial processes, and so on and so forth. The second collision course is what that means for socio-ecological systems. So the first thing we have to think about is that when we change the chemical composition of the atmosphere, this leads to an increase in global mean temperatures. And when we increase global mean temperatures, we start to see some consequences. We start to see, for example, an increase in the intensity and frequency of extreme weather events, things like hurricanes and cyclones. We saw, for example, last year, the most costly Atlantic hurricane season in history. We see, for example, changes in vector-borne and waterborne diseases, diseases like malaria and dengue fever and yellow fever, increasing in intensity and moving into parts of the globe that had not previously been susceptible to those sorts of diseases, putting pressure, of course, on healthcare systems and having implications for humans. We see changes, for example, to the distribution of water. Places that have suffered water scarcity and drought becoming more susceptible. Places that have suffered inundation and flooding becoming more susceptible. We see, for example, changes to ecosystems such as coral reefs, which are home to 25% of all marine life. And we see those coral reef systems bleaching and breaking apart with implications for that marine life, habitat, and of course, the very life that depends on that habitat for food and for shelter. So we see a variety of impacts, and those impacts then have subsequent impacts for human systems. We see, for example, the right to water threatened by the changes in water distribution. We see the right to food threatened by the fact that our soils are becoming more inundated with greenhouse gases. We see that drought is preventing our crops from growing, and as a consequence of that, coupled with rising global populations, we see increased food security around the world. We also, of course, see the impact on the right to life as a consequence of disease vectors and, of course, fatalities coming from major extreme weather events. We see an impact on adequate standard of living, on minimum means of subsistence. We see an impact on where people can live and what types of jobs that they can have. There is a body of research, for example, that traces the outbreak of the Syrian civil war back to a drought in eastern Syria. So all around the world, we see human systems, where we live, where we work, how we have mobility across the globe, and of course issues related to health affected by climate change. And so I want to emphasize that when we talk about the issue of climate change, we are not talking about an environmental issue. We are talking about a human issue, which brings me to the third collision course. And that is that those most susceptible to the impacts of climate change are typically marginalized and vulnerable communities. They are communities that already are subjected to what I call intersecting inequalities. So for example, one of the populations around the globe most impacted by climate change are women. And one of the most important statistics that I ever tell audiences about with regard to climate change is that 90% of all fatalities to extreme weather events in Bangladesh are women. Not because the women are exposed to a cyclone that men are not exposed to, but because women cannot leave home without a male guardian. They've never been taught to swim. They've never been taught to climb a tree. They don't have access to information, so they don't know when the extreme event is coming. They don't have rights to own land and property, therefore they haven't built a resource base that they can draw upon when disaster strikes. They don't have access to decision making, which means they cannot use their voice in municipal planning to make sure that the types of resilience strategies are in place to protect them. And they don't often have access to financial services, which again means when disaster strikes, they cannot source a credit line to help them rebuild their lives. And right around the globe, if you look at extreme events, you will always find that people of colour, marginalised groups, low-income groups, those who suffer social, economic, political, cultural and legal discrimination are those most impacted by climate change. So again, we're not talking specifically about an environmental issue alone. We're talking about a socio-ecological risk that needs a socio-ecological response in order to build our collective resilience. Now all of this, of course, has a human toll, but it also has a financial toll. And I'm not going to bore you with all the statistics on this particular slide, just to say that when we are talking about the dollar risks associated with climate change, we're not talking about millions or billions. We're talking about trillions of dollars. And that should hammer home in your head the notion that if we were facing trillion-dollar risks on any other issue area, we would be mobilized and acting on it immediately, because it makes absolute sense to avoid risk and instead seize the opportunities presented by a transition to a low-carbon future. So it's very important, again, to bear in mind, first and foremost, we're talking about trillions, and second of all, the data that produces this dollar value is not produced by environmental organizations. It's produced by the financial services sector itself, and particularly by insurance companies, who are keenly aware that they themselves will suffer major liabilities if we don't address this issue prominently. Most recently, for example, the CEO of AXA Insurance, one of the largest insurance companies in the world, said the 4 degrees Celsius world, which is where we were headed before Paris, is an uninsurable world. So it's very, very important, again, to bear in mind this is not an environmental issue. Suddenly, it's a financial issue that affects financial markets and financial stability. And as a consequence, you've recently seen the Financial Stability Board, led by the Bank of England and joined by the other central banks from the major industrialized countries, initiating something called the Task Force on Financial Disclosure related to climate change, so that they can properly understand how climate change is going to impact the financial system around the world and how we can take steps to avoid that. Now, of course, anybody in the audience could easily put up their hand and say, well, how do we know that all of this is actually true? And of course you're saying all of this because you're a left-leaning liberal who's bought into this hoax agenda. The reason I'm saying all of this is because we have scientific certainty that this is unequivocal. In other words, it is really happening, that it is accelerating. In other words, it is getting worse the longer we take to tackle it, and that it is human-induced. It is not caused by any natural cycle. And the reason we know that is because we have been rigorous in conducting scientific experiments on this issue over the course of at least 200 years. The original science of climate change predates the toaster. It's really not all of that complicated to understand the greenhouse gas effect. There was a very prominent Irish scientist in the early 19th century who conducted work carried forward by a French scientist, which was carried forward by a Swedish scientist. Then when we get into the 20th century, we see British scientists and ultimately American scientists taking this to the level that we now understand today. In the last 25 years alone, tens of thousands of scientific papers have been produced as a consequence of scientific experiment, and as you can see, the huge volume, 97% of all published peer-reviewed science, supports the notion of unequivocal, accelerating, and human-induced. Now, of course, when you turn on the news, particularly if you turn on certain channels more than others, you won't get that scientific rigor. You won't get that level of robust analysis. What you'll get is a talking head who is typically paid for by a lobby group, giving you the sense that this is not settled in an attempt to sow doubt in your mind. But I can assure you that this issue would not be taken forward unanimously by all the countries of the world and by major fossil fuel producing companies if there wasn't scientific rigor behind it. So now that we have that common foundation, let's move on to the issue of the Paris Agreement. There's only really 3 words that I want you to remember when thinking about a process that took approximately 25 years, that has thousands of pages of text behind it, and is a political agreement amongst all of the countries in the world, with one exception, which we'll get onto in just a moment. The 3 words that I want you to remember are unprecedented, defining, and immediate. By unprecedented, what I'm talking about is essentially 2 things. First of all, the level of ambition in the Paris Agreement has not been seen before. We have known about the climate problem for a very long time. In fact, President Lyndon Johnson was the first US president to be handed a report on climate change, back during his term, of course, in the mid-1960s. So we've known about the challenge for a very long time. And we've tried to grapple with that challenge at an international level, at least since 1992. But finally in Paris in 2015, we reached a level of ambition that is going to take major amounts of greenhouse gases out of the atmosphere if properly implemented. But it's also unprecedented because of the volume of participation, with all of the world for the first time participating in bold collective action to solve this problem. It is defining because it has substantial implications for government policy right around the globe, at the national and subnational level. It's also defining because of the impact it has on the market. The Paris Agreement sends a substantial market signal, and I'll talk a little bit about that in just a moment. And finally, it's immediate. This is not something that is being put off to some later date. It is an agreement that is being translated into policy as we speak. For example, the Chinese government translated the Paris Agreement almost immediately into their 13th five-year plan and are now initiating policies reflecting their commitment in Paris. Now, I mentioned that it is unprecedented in terms of both ambition and participation. First and foremost, 96% of countries globally have submitted national climate action plans. That's not the same as saying that they have signed the Paris Agreement. Not all countries who've signed the agreement have currently got a climate action plan in place. It takes a while to figure out where your emissions are, and it obviously takes a while to figure out what you're going to do about them. It's impressive to know that even within a 2.5-year time period, countries are backing up their pledges with concrete policy proposals on everything from energy to food and transport and land use and so on. Now, what's striking about the image on the right-hand side is that here you have a map of 197 sovereign nation states across the globe. And I want to point out that in that right-hand side of the graphic, you have everything from the Communist Party of China to the theocracy in Saudi Arabia and Iran, from a Christian Democrat government in Germany to a conservative government in the United Kingdom, to the descendants of Simón Bolívar in Latin America, to all manner of unsavory administrations in Africa. You have every political stripe from the far left to the far right. You have functional countries, and you also have a country like Syria that doesn't really have a functioning government at all. And you have all of them signed up to the principle of the scientific consensus and to the principle that every country must act in unison to tackle this issue, not only because it's a risk, but because it makes sense to accelerate the transition to a low-carbon economy. And then you have one country on the left that has decided that they would rather opt out of all of this, and we'll discuss why that is the case in a moment. Now, one of the issues that I'm often presented with when talking in the United States about this issue, and you will have figured out by now that I'm not an American, I'm always asked, well, what about China? Why should we act if China isn't acting? That is yet another one of the myths that you often hear, because the reality is far, far different. The first thing I would say is that China has put in place one of the most ambitious national climate action plans in the world. They have first and foremost agreed to peak their fossil fuel uses and carbon dioxide emissions around 2030, and they've agreed to put in place 20% of all of their energy mix to be sourced from renewables also by 2030. To put that into context, that 20% is the equivalent of all the electricity generation in the United States today. So in the course of the next 15 years, they are going to put in a renewable energy source the equivalent of all of the electricity generated in this country today in 15 years. And they will do it because they have the capacity to do it and they have a political system that allows them to do it. In addition to that, you see that China is already the #1 investor globally in renewable energy. And as a consequence of that, they are becoming genuinely the energy superpower of the 21st century. They are not investing in the energy infrastructure of the 19th century, the way other countries are. They're investing in tomorrow. And as a consequence of that, you'll see that they're creating substantial numbers of well-paid jobs. 1.8 million jobs in renewables alone, added in 2015, as opposed to 157,000 in the United States. China is not doing this because we're asking them to do it. They're not doing this because we are threatening them. They are doing this first and foremost because they're aware of climate risk. The bulk of water in China comes from Himalayan glacial melt, and the bulk of cities and economic infrastructure in China is located around the coast, which is susceptible to all manner of climate impacts, including sea level rises, storm surges, and extreme weather events. And they're doing it because they know that it makes economic sense to invest in the transition. And finally, they're doing it because the single biggest threat to the Chinese Communist Party's grip on power is discontent amongst the Chinese populace. And so they're trying to head off that discontent by putting in place social and environmental policies to tackle social and environmental unrest. So this is a leading country, not a laggard country, and we can no longer use China as an excuse for our own inaction in the United States. Now, I promise you this is the one and only graph that you'll see as part of this presentation, but it is important to give you some degree of context as to what the Paris Agreement achieved. So before Paris, we were on course for 4.8 degrees Celsius temperature rises by the end of this century. And to put that into perspective, the basic crops that we depend upon for food security, maize and wheat and rice and corn, they cannot grow and be sustained above 4 degrees Celsius of temperature rises. So we were looking at a world by the end of this century where food security was going to become a substantial issue, not just for places like Ethiopia and Eritrea, but for places like the United States. As a consequence of the Paris Agreement, we now have national climate action plans in place that deviate that global mean temperature rise to somewhere around 2.8 to 3.2 degrees Celsius. That's still not good enough, and many of the people who critique the Paris Agreement do so for the very legitimate reason that it is not yet sufficient to solve the problem. If we really want to solve the problem, we've got to hold temperatures to 2 degrees Celsius or less, and ideally, we've got to hold temperatures to 1.5 degrees Celsius or less. I used to work for a country called the Maldives, based in the southern Indian Ocean. 50% of the economy of the Maldives is dependent on coral reef systems because their dominant industries are tourism and fisheries. And once we get to 2 degrees Celsius, those industries are gone. 50% of jobs, 50% of the economy, gone. But more importantly, if we go above 1.5 degrees Celsius of temperature rises, the Maldives will disappear from the face of the earth, because the highest point in the Maldives is 1 meter above sea level. 1,200 islands, 1 meter above sea level. At 1.5 degrees Celsius, they disappear under the ocean, and 3,000 years of human history in these islands disappears with them. So we have a long way to go if we're to solve this problem. But I want to draw your attention for one moment to that shaded area, that area between 4.8 and 2.8, because that is more than just emissions reductions. That is a global economic stimulus for the world economy. Because in order to get from 4.8 to 2.8 degrees Celsius, we have to invest in clean energy infrastructure. And the national climate action plans that I mentioned earlier, those 188 plans that have been submitted, together they anticipate $13.5 trillion in clean energy investments over the next 15 years. Those are investments in all manner of energy solutions, not just wind and solar, but also hydro. They're investments in efficiency. They're investments in industries and in households. They create well-paying jobs that in turn lead to people spending their money back in our economies. Who is going to grasp this economic stimulus is a key question coming out of the Paris Agreement. And right now, the answer is China. I'm not going to bore you with too much on this particular slide, other than to say, for those people who do critique the Paris Agreement for not being ambitious enough, there is a solution baked into the design. And that solution is that every year there will be a review of the current pledges, and there will be reviews of where our current trajectory is heading. And on 5-year cycles, there will be opportunities for governments to come back to the table with increased pledges. So the hope is that the current set of national climate action plans are the baseline that we begin with, but they're not the end point. The idea is that we increase ambition progressively over time. Now, the final thing that I want to say about the Paris Agreement as a segue into the next section is that the Paris Agreement was made in the United States. It was a consequence of years of strong advocacy by the previous administration, by the amazing research institutes and academic institutes in the United States, by the wellspring of civil society actors, not only in the environment movement, but in faith-based movements and social justice movements, by the voices of business and by the voices of trade unions, all around the United States, helping to shape this agreement. In particular, what was key to this agreement was the bilateral relationship between the United States and China. They worked tirelessly behind the scenes together over a 2-year period, and it was both the #1 priority issue they worked on, and it was the #1 issue where they were able to progress together. And because the United States and China were bought into this issue and shaping this agenda, they were able to bring other countries around the world along with them. In addition, all of the red lines that the United States had held for 2 decades on climate negotiations, they were able to secure their red lines. They were able to get from the design of this agreement everything they had always wanted. Most notably, they wanted to break down the barrier that had always existed between the action industrialized countries would take and the action that emerging economies would take. So, for example, those of you in the room who might remember the Kyoto Protocol, one of the critique of the Kyoto Protocol was that the European Union and the United States needed to lead with emissions reductions, but China got a free pass. So what the United States wanted this time was no free passes for everybody, for anybody. Everybody had to act, and they secured that. So what you have is an agreement designed, promoted, and settled in Washington. And then this gentleman comes along, and this gentleman decides that we are going to take a different course. Now, what I'm about to present to you is the result of research that I conducted between 2015 and 2017, funded by a US philanthropic organization, with the express purpose of, first of all, understanding what was likely to happen under a President Trump administration, but more importantly, what could we begin to do about it? Not just what we could begin to do in terms of resisting it, but how could we begin to build an argument and an evidence base that would persuade the non-usual suspects to embrace the climate agenda? Because it is very, very important that this once again becomes a bipartisan issue. This was never a Democrat issue exclusively. This has always been something that both Democrats and Republicans could buy into. If you think of Theodore Roosevelt and the National Park System, if you think of Richard Nixon and the EPA, if you think of George H.W. Bush as being the president that actually signed the United States up to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, there has been a very substantial lobby within the Republican Party going back many, many decades in support of stewarding and safeguarding the global commons. That has changed, of course, as the party has leaned more to the right, and it particularly has changed as a consequence of the new administration. But it remains the case that if we are going to succeed on this issue, Democrats need to leave a space for Republicans to walk into, and Republicans need to be ready to walk into that space. If this is exclusively a Democrat issue, if this becomes exclusively tribal, then we will continue in a cycle of boom and bust presidencies on this issue, and we will never get to where we need to be. So, where are we and where are we likely to go? We looked at 3 different areas where we thought that the Trump presidency would have an impact on climate change, and we looked at 2 possible scenarios. So the 3 areas were decarbonization. In other words, what is happening in the real economy, irrespective of national policy. Second of all, diplomacy. What impact would the US withdrawal from Paris or a backsliding of US leadership on climate, what effect would that have on the action that other governments around the world are likely to take? And then finally, discourse. How would a Trump presidency and their approach to climate change impact the way we speak about this issue, the way we research this issue, and the types of knowledge and information that we have as a community about this issue? The first scenario we looked at was called putting the brakes on. And by that we essentially meant a return to the years of George W. Bush. He and of course his administration were hostile to climate action, but they were hostile to climate action in a way that was a little bit more politically sophisticated. They realized that there was political capital to be wasted if they were too aggressively hostile on this issue. And so what they tried to do was really slow things down, but they didn't come out in an openly aggressive stance on this issue for fear of the repercussions. So the first scenario we looked at was a return to those years. We thought, for example, about maybe seeing some of the old George W. Bush personnel returning to key positions in the EPA, Department of Energy, in the White House, and so on. And then the second scenario we looked at was called pulling the wheels off, and you can imagine that that is not a very welcome scenario. We did not look at a third scenario called a low-carbon climate utopia because we just didn't think that that was a reasonable thing to look for under a Trump presidency. Now, what we found was that there's an awful lot of things going on above the waterline, but like with an iceberg, most of the things that are happening below the waterline and are less easy to see. So, for example, one of the things that happened very, very early on, as early as the transition team itself, was the placing of personnel into key positions in the administration who are openly hostile to the issue of climate action and who historically have been documented as being on the payroll of fossil fuel industries. So, for example, a gentleman called Myron Ebel, who has a very, very long track record working with the Heritage Foundation and the American Enterprise Institute and various institutes related to David and Charles Koch, he was put in charge of the transition, looking at who would advise the president in the White House and who would be in charge at the Environmental Protection Agency. And since that transition has happened, we now, of course, see people like the former governor of Texas, Rick Perry, in charge of the Department of Energy, an open climate skeptic. We see the Secretary of the Department of Interior, Secretary Zinke, very opposed to climate action. And most prominent of all, we see the Administrator of the Environmental Protection Agency, who had built a career taking all manner of lawsuits against national climate initiatives, now as head of the Environmental Protection Agency. We see policy, of course, changing. Immediately upon coming into office, the administration began efforts to roll back, for example, the Clean Power Plan. It began efforts to roll back the CAFE standards for vehicles. It began efforts to roll back funding going to science and research. It began efforts to roll back funding going, for example, to the Green Climate Fund, which helps drive low-carbon solutions all around the world. We see financial incentives changing substantially. The budget that the Trump administration submitted to Congress was very heavily against any form of climate initiative, both domestic and international. We see a shift in public reasoning and the terms of the debate. So, for example, government websites that had previously championed climate risk and an understanding of resilience have been taken down. The Environmental Protection Agency no longer talks about climate change, it talks instead about environmental resilience and leaves climate change out of the equation. We see major organizations that are not affiliated with the government now receiving guidelines from their senior staff saying you must not talk about climate change in public. In fact, one of the leading global humanitarian organizations has a guidance coming from the very top that says if you're asked a question about climate change in public, do not answer it, instead refer people to academic institutions. This is an institute that is world-renowned, an organization that is world-renowned, and an organization that is doing wonderful work on the issue of climate change. But even they are afraid to be coming out and publicly speaking about it for fear of the repercussions.
What organization?
I'm not going to name them because they actually asked me not to name them, and I'm on film. And then the issue that I worry about more than anything else is the court system. Because at the moment, we have a 6-3 court, is that right? 5-4? 5-4. 5-4 court. The action of the US federal government right now on climate change is all dependent on executive authority of the president, because there is no legislation. And that executive authority of the president is dependent on a Supreme Court case from 2007 called Massachusetts versus EPA. And that court case ruled that greenhouse gases should be treated as a pollutant under the Clean Air Act. That in turn gives the EPA and the president the mandate to reduce greenhouse gases. Now, if the current president has the opportunity to put more people onto the Supreme Court, there is a real danger that that case will be re-examined and that that ruling will be overturned. And if that happens, not only do we see the undermining of climate action under this presidency, we see the tool that any future president could use to lead on climate change being taken out of the toolbox. And of course, in a divided Congress and in a divided America, it becomes very, very hard for any federal level leadership on this issue, absent executive authority from the president. So as a consequence of that, this is really how we mapped out the various scenarios that we're facing under a Trump presidency. We didn't really believe that decarbonisation and diplomacy were threatened in the short term, because the reality is the real economy is decarbonising. We're seeing a growing disparity between economic growth and unit of greenhouse gas emissions associated with that. And we see business leadership on this issue growing and growing and growing. So in the short term, we don't think that that will change. But once you get out to the medium and long term, if, for example, they begin to reinforce fossil fuel subsidies, and if they remove some of the tax credits that go to renewable energy, that could become far, far more dangerous to decarbonisation in the real economy than, for example, repeal of the Clean Power Plan or the CAFE standards. And similarly, when you get onto issues of diplomacy, as soon as the Trump administration came out and said that they intended to withdraw from the Paris Agreement, in unison, all of the other countries in the world came forward and said, we remain committed and we will go on with our commitments irrespective of US policy. So in the short term, the Paris Agreement is strong, it's robust, it will go on. But over the longer term, there are many, many countries who would like to withdraw. There are many, many countries who feel that alleviating poverty, providing energy security to populations that are growing, and decarbonisation are too difficult for them to manage on their own. And if they begin to see the US taking a free pass on this issue, and if they begin to see some of the finance drying up as a consequence of that, they may begin over the longer term to revisit their commitment to the Paris Agreement. Now, the final thing that I will say about this is again to tackle one of the major myths on this. The President, when announcing the withdrawal from Paris, really embedded that decision in the needs of coal country. And he looked across the Appalachian region and he said, we are going to bring coal back. And that's why we're withdrawing from the Paris Agreement. Nothing could be further from the truth, not least, of course, because he closed down the Appalachian Economic Commission upon taking office, but because coal has been dying as an industry in the United States for decades, long before the Paris Agreement came along. It's been dying as a consequence of automation. It's been dying because the coal is simply harder to get at. It's been dying because the coal is not as productive. But most importantly, it's been dying because the price point of fossil fuels, particularly coal, is losing its competitive edge when compared to the price point of renewable energy. So we have on the one hand a dying industry, and on the other hand, we have a growing industry that is in need of support, but also if it is supported, not only can provide us with a clean environment, not only can help us tackle the issue of climate change, but will be a major, major stimulus to our economy as a consequence of creating well-paying jobs.
Can you go back to that other slide so I can get the last piece of that right there? Thank you. Yeah, that's good, thank you.
Okay. So, I want to now turn back to a more positive spin on what is happening in the real economy and look at what the new American climate leadership looks like. And I could structure this particular part of the presentation on all manner of different foundations. I could talk about what's happening at the municipal level, happening at the state level. I could talk about the fact that Governor Brown of California and former Mayor Bloomberg are hosting a large summit on climate change in California in September. But on this particular occasion, what I'm going to talk about specifically is the private sector. And the reason I'm going to do this is because this is a real game changer. For those of you in the room who've worked on environmental issues for a long time, you will be accustomed to thinking of major corporations as being a hostile force in this space that we need to argue with and defeat if we are to succeed on issues related to climate change. And in my previous jobs, working for example, the European Union within the Environment Directorate General, I was also accustomed to companies only coming to visit me when they wanted to kill a particular piece of environmental legislation. I'm very pleased to say that that is now changing with substantial repercussions. So over the last 4 years, I've worked with a coalition called We Mean Business. And the prime goal of We Mean Business was first and foremost to change the conversation on climate change from sacrifice and burden sharing to economic opportunity. Second of all, to influence the emergence of a new policy-enabling environment for climate action, such as the Paris Agreement, and thirdly, to encourage major corporations around the world to take on a leadership role and to tangibly reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. As of today, we have close to 600 companies who together are worth more than $8 trillion, and we have close to 200 investors who manage over $20 trillion of assets, collectively making over 1,200 commitments to climate action. These are commitments to end deforestation in their supply chain, to procure 100% of their energy from renewable sources, to put in place science-based emissions reductions targets, to put in place carbon pricing and to advocate for carbon pricing, to be honest and transparent in how they disclose their climate risk and what strategies they're taking to build resilience to their investors, and so on and so forth. 11 different commitment areas and 1,200 plus commitments. And you'll see that there are a lot of early wins in here already. First, the largest private sector employer in the world, which is Walmart, have taken on board a science-based emission reduction target. And interestingly, they're also going to ask their top 100 suppliers to take on science-based targets of their own as a cost of doing business with Walmart. Substantial implications right across the supply chain. Interestingly, when they designed that target and when they announced it, they decided to announce it at Net Impact, which is a conference aimed at millennials. And the reason they did that is because the CEO of Walmart is very concerned of the reputational risk to his company of not being a leader on this issue. And in his words, his customer base is dying. He needs to appeal to a new generation of customers, and the way to do that is to be progressive on the issue of climate change. Second of all, when the Obama administration's Clean Power Plan was being sued in federal court by, for example, Scott Pruitt, who at the time was Attorney General of Oklahoma, the 4 largest companies in the world by market capitalization took the unprecedented step of submitting an amicus brief to the Supreme Court. In other words, they acted as friends of the court and argued in favor of maintaining the Clean Power Plan, because they argued it was good for their business, it was good for their consumers to have access to affordable renewable energy.
Could you please name those corporations?
Those are Microsoft, Amazon, Apple, and I believe it was Google. And at the time of the amicus briefs, they were the 4 largest companies in the world by market capitalization. Then, of course, we see when the Trump administration decided that it would announce withdrawal from the Paris Agreement, we saw a mass mobilization of companies right across the country. We saw companies taking out full-page adverts in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, and we also saw a variety of corporate CEOs withdrawing themselves from the President's Economic Advisory Council in protest. Now, to give you a sense as to who some of these companies actually are, I'm going to tell you briefly about 2 of these initiatives. The one is the Science-Based Emissions Reduction Target, and you'll see here a variety of companies that you will know extremely well. Unilever, for example, is a company that is present in 8 out of 10 homes around the world every single day. They reach more people than any other company. And you'll see, of course, a variety of sectors in here. You'll see consumer products companies, you'll see food companies, you'll see technology companies, clothing companies, and so on. There are more than 300 companies now across the globe who've taken on board this commitment, which is essentially a commitment to match the Paris ambition within the confines of their own operations. What you'll also see, a separate initiative, is a whole series of companies who've agreed to purchase 100% of all of their power from renewable sources. Now, I will say that this particular initiative has one important provision that is very important for you to bear in mind as municipal activists, and that is that many of the companies who are embarking on this are now finding that they are constrained, A, because they're faced with a monopoly energy provider who will only give them access to fossil fuels, or B, they are not being provided with the zoning permission that they need to produce on-site renewable energy. So that becomes very, very important for municipal leaders and for state leaders. What are you going to do to ensure that we do not have monopoly energy providers, or if we do have monopoly energy providers, that they are compelled to provide a proportion of their mix in renewable sources? What are we also going to do to look beyond climate policies to make sure that, for example, our zoning laws are catalytic and conducive of the transition to a low-carbon economy? Now, I want to really highlight a second important element of this particular initiative, and that is, these companies are now making location decisions based on the available of renewable energy. So for example, the province of Quebec in Canada is now actively going around to all of these companies and saying to them, instead of locating yourself in Alabama and putting your data center down there, where they won't give you access to renewable energy, why don't you locate in Quebec, where we can give you all the renewable energy you can need? And as a consequence, Quebec has turned renewable energy into a brand. They've turned renewable energy into an offer that attracts economic development and that attracts employment. And my advice is that every state in the United States should be thinking along these terms. How do you use the transition to a low-carbon future as a magnet to attract major corporations around the world who are now making financial, operational, and location decisions based on the availability of affordable, secure, renewable energy? And then finally, on this particular segment, it's important for companies to go beyond acting. It's important that they now engage in education and mobilization. And so I find this particular slide extremely interesting, because I mentioned earlier that Walmart has taken on board a science-based emissions reductions target. And of course, Walmart is the largest employer in New Hampshire, and it's also the largest employer in 22 states around the nation. If Walmart was to take some time to educate their employees, and crucially, to educate their customers about the importance of dealing with climate risk and adopting a climate-compatible lifestyle, that would have huge implications for how we deal with this issue. Because of course, it's not just Democrats going to shop at Walmart. And of course, Walmart and the Walton family are not historically known for being a very liberal-leaning social justice family. So to have the Waltons as an influence champion on this issue would give real credibility, and to have the audience that they can reach politically, in terms of the consumer base, and in terms of their employees, would be extremely impactful.
Who are you quoting on the slide?
This is a slide that is taken from a wonderful website for infographics, which I would recommend, called The Visual Capitalist. And I can't remember who the source was for this particular slide. I believe it was the Department of Labor Statistics, but I would have to go back and look at the original data place.
But the statement in quotes at the top, do you remember?
Oh, excuse me, the statement of the quote. This particular quote, interestingly, comes from the former head of IKEA, and you might recall that he recently passed.
Okay.
And he and his CEO and a number of the C-suite officials were talking about IKEA's own leadership on this issue, which is long-standing. But what they were grappling with was the notion that it is no longer sufficient to simply take action. We've now got to think through a new paradigm for what climate leadership actually looks like, and that's where they landed on the final term, activist, which for them means let's not only set our own strategy, let's be out there advocating for this issue.
So maybe you could tell us a little more about what Quebec is doing?
I really can't beyond what I've said. I met with the people within the government of Quebec, the provincial government of Quebec, probably about 18 months ago. And at the time, the strategy that they had was that they had an abundance of renewable energy, predominantly from hydropower, which has its own environmental footprint problems, but let's leave that to one side for a second. And they decided that rather than just take an approach of, we've got this renewable energy, we're meeting our own Paris target, that they were going to use that as a branding opportunity for them to go out and approach these companies. So when they hear about these initiatives such as RE100, what they do is they make a catalogue of the companies who are embarking on these initiatives, and they approach the companies to try and encourage them for relocation. So imagine for a second what's going on with the second headquarters for Amazon. And imagine all the cities and states around the country who are going to Amazon and essentially telling them, we will pay you to come and relocate to our state. This is a variation on that, but instead of giving tax breaks or building infrastructure, the sell to these companies is, we will provide you with the renewable energy you need to meet your target.
Thank you.
Okay, now we're getting into the final part of the presentation, which is how do we begin to translate some of this into what we do at the municipal level. And here we'll be a little bit briefer. And some of this will be very obvious, but unfortunately I cannot give you any more specific tactical guidance, given that I don't know very much about the footprint of Concord. The first thing that always needs to happen when embarking on a climate strategy, whether you are a company or whether you are a government, is you need to understand your baseline. You need to understand where your emissions come from. And my advice is that you need to tackle all of the various sources. Time and time again I see people making mistakes by focusing and narrowing in on the one dominant source of their emissions, trying to take a huge bite out of that one dominant source, and as a consequence, missing opportunities, but also expending an awful lot of political capital by trying to do too much on too narrow with a very vocal and activist opponent up against them. So I would say the first most important thing you need to do is understand the totality of your baseline emissions. They will always come from these various sources, but of course the way in which this is weighted is going to be very much dependent on the individual locality. Some localities the energy footprint will be higher or lower, other localities the transport footprint will be higher or lower. For example, in European municipalities, the transport footprint is lower because we have more densely populated urban centres, we have much better public transportation, and as a consequence we have less dependence on very large gas-guzzling vehicles to get us around. So I would suspect, for example, the average US city, leaving aside New York for a second, but the average US city, the transport footprint would be relatively high compared, for example, to a European municipality. But it's very, very important to look at the totality, because when you look at the totality, you can follow what's called the wedges approach. That means you get to a substantial amount of ambition by taking smaller bite sizes out of each of the various sectors. How you decide to go about that, of course, then becomes the crux of the matter. The second thing that I would recommend that you do is called benchmarking. And that essentially means finding out what your peer group is doing. If you are, for example, Coca-Cola, what you always want to know is what is Pepsi doing. Because you don't want to be too far behind Pepsi, and you don't want to be too far out ahead of them. You want to have a solid understanding of where your peer group is so that you can position yourself appropriately. For a municipality, the main reason for doing benchmarking is because A, you want to know what the good practice is that you can follow, and B, equally important, you want to know what the worst practice is so that you can avoid it. There is an awful lot of worst practice out there on both emissions reductions and also on resilience building. A lot of money has been wasted, for example, spending unnecessary infrastructure projects to protect buildings from being flooded and doing very little to protect populations who will be impacted. So it's very, very important to benchmark, to learn from worst practice as well as best practice. Thirdly, it's very important to engage and mobilize. In part because you want to generate the best ideas, of course, that come from the community, but also in part because climate action is a generational undertaking. It requires political support that outlives any one political cycle, and therefore it requires the buy-in of the community to sustain it through not only favourable winds, but also during moments when the winds fail or when the winds are heading in the opposite direction. So the process of consultation, as well as the outcomes of consultation, are extremely important to secure the type of bipartisan and cross-community buy-in that we need to succeed on this issue. And even if that means that we take a chunk of ambition away, simply to secure that buy-in, it becomes very important. I can recall, for example, working at the federal level a number of years ago under something called the Waxman-Markey Emissions Trading Scheme, a bill that was put before the House of Representatives. And the reason that bill failed is because the opponents were uniform and vocal in saying no, and the advocates were divided as to whether we should say yes or not. And I guarantee you that every single advocate who at that particular time, in 2009 and 2010, said that the emissions trading system was not ambitious enough and therefore didn't warrant our support, they're all saying now, gosh, I wish I had that emissions trading bill. I wish we had that 10 years of experience. I wish we had that foundation to build upon today. So it's very important, even if you lose a little bit of ambition, to ensure this process is a success and to build on that foundation. It's very important to collaborate, and by collaborate I mean first and foremost joined up government. As I said at the outset, we are dealing with a socio-ecological issue. We cannot address that with an environmental policy on its own. We need to look, for example, at taxation policy. We need to look at zoning policy. We need to look at our healthcare systems. We need to look at education policy so that we examine and overcome that information deficit I talked about earlier when I talked about the science. We need to think about social protection. If we have a carbon price, for example, it is very important that that carbon price contains measures that protect low-income populations and the most vulnerable in the community. A, because it might fail if it doesn't include that component, and B, because it will be very, very essential to avoid amplifying inequalities by having a poorly designed climate response. I have experience with that as well. When I worked for the World Bank some years ago, there was a major global food crisis that put 400 million people around the world back into abject poverty. And the source of that global food crisis was the subsidies for biofuels put in place in the European Union and the United States to try and wean people off fossil fuels and put people onto ethanol instead. So a poorly designed climate policy can have just as bad negative implications as avoiding climate action to begin with. So we have to design the policy appropriately. That requires joined-up government. But it also requires collaboration with multiple different types of stakeholders. For example, we have a greater chance of success if we now reach out beyond government and begin to work with the private sector. It's also very important that we think through the issue of sequencing. Ambition often comes as a consequence of committing to something, succeeding, generating the confidence that you need to build your trust in policy, and then recommitting all over again. It also requires a constant process of review and evaluation of the policy to make sure it is succeeding and not having negative consequences. So just as the Paris Agreement has these 5-year cycles of ambition baked into the system, it's very important to bake in sequencing into your municipal strategies so that you conduct that review, so that you build that confidence and therefore have the means to carry on with greater ambition subsequently. And I think the last thing that I want to say is that the narrative of how we tackle this issue is extremely important. I feel, personally, and as a consequence of my experience, that if I were to stand in front of an audience and say, everybody, please join me in a rescue mission for a doomed planet, very, very few of you would be willing to give up your time to commit to that endeavor. But if I were to say to you, join me in building a better and more inclusive world, you might feel mobilized, you might feel energized, you might feel hopeful, and as a consequence you might commit. It is very important as we go forward on this issue that A, we don't sell it as a liberal issue and a Democrat issue, because we need to bring other people into the space. But B, that we do not sell this as burden sharing, sacrifice, and futility. This has got to be an optimistic message. It has got to be an optimistic mission. It has got to be about opportunity. It's got to be about building inclusive economies as well as building climate resilient economies. If it's not about those things, we will continue to be an environment community that speaks to itself, and we will continue to fail on bringing new voices and new constituencies into this transition. So I would urge you, when thinking about your local action, to think about the value of optimism in promoting social change. Finally, this is a framework that you can begin to use in your own life. It's partly related to what I mentioned earlier with regards to the quote from the IKEA people. When you're thinking about leadership, it's obviously important to take action. That means in your own life taking action with regards to your transportation use, your energy use in the home, your diet, and so on. It's also very important to begin to think about how we might enable others. At the meta level, for example, the financial services sector needs to enable others by providing financial products and services and vehicles that facilitate investments in low carbon technology and begin to reduce the investments going to fossil fuels. But in our own lives, enabling people means educating them on this issue, being vocal about this issue, but also listening to what other people are saying as to why they might be resistant or hesitant, so that we can learn from that and come back with better arguments. And then finally, the issue of influence. A defining moment for me in the 2016 presidential election actually happened the day after the election. My office was in Manhattan, right next to Union Square, and there was a protest taking place right down Broadway by a group of people, large group, shouting, "He is not our president," and carrying placards, "Not our president." And those people were interviewed and polled, and it turned out that only 56% of them had voted the previous day. The most important power that we have as individuals is first and foremost our power to vote, and second of all, the power of the purse, how we choose to spend our money. If we don't exercise those two powers, everything else that we try to do will unfortunately not have nearly as enough impact and implications. So it's very, very important that we begin to hold our elected officials accountable, that we elevate this particular issue on the agenda, that we make it known to them that irrespective of their party, that we will be watching their voting record and voting on this issue, and that of course we begin to spend our money in those places that commit to a transition to a low carbon future, and begin to hold our money back from those who do not. They are very, very important powers that we have available. All of this is to say we are now at an inflection point. We are now at a moment to make choices. And we have a very stark choice ahead of us over the coming years. We can either decide to take a path that leads us towards a low carbon, inclusive and climate resilient economy. Or we can decide to take a path that exacerbates climate risk, that amplifies exclusion, and that causes massive disruptions for all of us, but particularly for the most marginalized and the most vulnerable in our world. We have to make the right choice. If we don't make the right choice, we will feel the repercussions, as we already did last year, with the most active Atlantic hurricane season and the most costly Atlantic hurricane season on record. But truly what will happen is that the generations that follow us will have to carry the burden of our mistakes. So it's our choice and it's our call to action, and I hope you all go to continue on your journey as local activists on this issue. Thank you very much, and I'll take any comments or questions. Of this equation, because we waste enormous amounts of energy by having the wrong cars with the wrong engines and the wrong homes without insulation. So energy conservation absolutely has to be a component of this. The second thing is energy efficiency. We lose a huge amount of energy from production to final use as a consequence of outdated transmission mechanisms. We don't, for example, invest sufficiently in the energy grid. And as a consequence, an awful lot of energy is lost and never used because of that outdated infrastructure. That could be tackled if we were to invest in the energy infrastructure, or if we were to what's called democratize energy infrastructure by, for example, having more localized renewable energy sources as opposed to the major energy infrastructure projects that we've had for the last number of decades. So those two things are extremely important. Then when you get to the issue of population, I would say that population is really important, but for a number of reasons. First and foremost, when I was born in 1975, there were 3.6 billion people on the planet. Now there are over 7 billion, and we're headed by 2050 towards 10 billion. So as you've alluded to, more people using more things equals more trouble. In addition to that, the habits of this growing population are shifting considerably, because that population is increasingly a middle class rather than a poor population. So if you look, for example, in the developing world where the population is growing the fastest, you have countries like India where the population is growing, the consumption habits of that population is expanding, but also, critically, they're moving away from a historically traditional vegetarian diet towards a diet that is more beef and, of course, more stressful on aquaculture. And the more beef we use, as opposed to vegetarian diets, the larger the consequences on the planet. So it's a combination of numbers, but it's also a combination of what those increasing numbers are doing with their lifestyles. I could give you the other example of China now becoming a tourism exporting country as opposed to a country that imports tourists. And a lot of these Chinese tourists are now going around the world on cruise ships, heavily polluting, heavily damaging for the atmosphere, but also for the oceans. So does that mean we have to reduce population? My personal opinion is, yes, we have to be mindful of population. But I would say that if you stand in a global meeting and start talking about population, the types of comments that will come back at you are horrendous. Absolutely horrendous, because there's a history in many, many countries of population control happening through the harshest, most intrusive means possible. And so ultimately, population, in my view, has to be a personal choice for individual families and for women, in my view. Personally, I don't believe that anyone other than an individual woman should have control over reproductive rights. But if you want to know the basic science, then the biggest single step in terms of reducing emissions within a household, for example, is to reduce the number of children within that household. I see 1, 2, so I'll come here first, and then 3, yeah.
Isn't it true, though, that as the populations become more affluent, they tend to automatically reduce the family size? I mean, historically, hasn't that been the case?
Yes, but what are those families doing? So, for example, I have just come from Manhattan, where I was living with my one child in a 740 square foot apartment, to a house in Manchester, Vermont that has 5 bedrooms. And what is the consumption habit of my son? The consumption habit of my son is vastly higher. He's probably 15 to 20 tons of CO2 equivalent, as opposed to the consumption habits of one child in India. So you will often find, for example, that a household of 5, 6, 7 people in India will still have a far smaller carbon footprint than a one-person household in the United States because of the size of our homes, the number of electronic devices we use, the nature of our diets, the types of transport we use, the type of travel, particularly overseas travel that we engage in. So population, yes, but it's much more complicated than that because of the carbon footprint of individuals all around the world. And the United States per capita has one of the highest carbon footprints because of our materialism, I would say, more than anything else. Please.
Comment and then a question. As a retired consultant, I think you did an excellent job with the presentation, so thank you. The question is, and related to a comment you made about how companies could help by educating their employees and their customers. I think that's a great idea because the reach is there. I don't know how we do that other than, as you said, demand it. But also I wonder if you think it might be good to have educational institutions that have influence, like the Ivy League schools, to inform their alumni that climate change is, as you say, real and serious and deserving of their attention. Do you think that could be an avenue to pursue?
I think that's a vital avenue, to be honest. So my work over the course of 2 decades has required me to become a translator. Because if you're dealing with a policymaker, it's a very different vocabulary than dealing with a politician, which is different again to a scientist, which is different again to a business person. And even within the political space, I can remember working in Washington, D.C., and I would go to Capitol Hill to speak about climate change, and I would speak about environment, and a certain number of people would speak to me and no one else. And then I would go and speak about competitiveness, and the number of people would grow. And then I would go and speak about national security, and it would grow again. So even with the politicians, I had to create a vocabulary of arguments for how I would present this issue in order to appeal to different constituencies. Within the private sector, I think the business schools in particular are really fundamental, because if you look at why a company acts on this, it's not because of altruism, it's because of what's called enterprise risk management. So a company, for example, is concerned that it has stranded assets as a result of the transition to a low carbon economy. A company is concerned that some of its operations might be threatened by extreme weather events. You have, for example, the case of Verizon in New York City under Superstorm Sandy. They lost $1 billion because they had copper wire cabling instead of fiber optic cabling, and fiber optic is resilient and copper wire dissolves in salt water. So they lost $1 billion, they lost customers, and they had a reputational hit. As a consequence of operations, reputation and finance, they now care about climate change. What a business school can do is it can translate the world of climate into the language of enterprise risk management, and it can train the business leaders of tomorrow about how climate interfaces with marketing, how it interfaces with accounting, how it interfaces with strategy. At the moment, if you want to go and learn about climate in an MBA, you have to go to a specialized course, such as, for example, the Ross School in the University of Michigan has a specialized course on corporate social responsibility. But it would be a far better idea for Dartmouth and Chicago and Harvard and all of the best MBA schools in this country to not put in place a separate parallel climate or sustainability course, but to mainstream sustainability throughout the entire course. I think that would have a huge impact.
Thank you.
Please.
How do we get around the not in my backyard concept when it comes to these projects? I'm specifically thinking of New Hampshire and the Northern Pass situation, where most people that would be involved in energy efficiency and energy conservation would be in favor of increased hydropower, yet a lot of people in New Hampshire decided, was able to pressure to vote against it because it would change the environment in terms of the visual aspects. And in New Hampshire we have all these small towns that are basically only can really do things like once a year at the town meeting. You can't hire extra people unless it's at a town meeting. You can't increase the budget in a certain area unless it's at a town meeting. So what would you say to deal with that type of situation? We're not in the big cities that can adjust faster.
Yep.
We're in smaller towns that take a long time to adjust.
So I think that's a very interesting question, and I don't have an easy answer to it. I really don't. I would say that there's a number of ways that I would approach it. The first thing I would do is I would go back to the guidance or the question of this gentleman earlier on, and that is, I would not only think about the generation of new energy or resources, I would think first of all, about the low-hanging fruit in each community. And whether that low-hanging fruit is efficiency, or whether it is tackling a different source of greenhouse gas emissions, I would focus on that particular aspect. The second thing that I would do, and this is not a silver bullet, I have no notion as to whether this would work or not, but my instinct is you always have to present these issues in a series of arguments and incentives that resonate with the audience you're speaking to. So if I'm speaking, for example, to a corporate audience, I will speak about enterprise risk management and profits. If I'm speaking to a state leader, for example, at this particular moment, I will talk about economic opportunity and particularly the value of attracting jobs and new companies into the state. Now, I live in a similar state, of course. I live in Vermont, where the NIMBYism is just as pronounced. There, it's predominantly concerned with wind power, for example. I would try to see whether there are other sources beyond wind power. So, for example, if having a major windmill is an issue, then I would begin to think about whether solar is going to be an alternative that could produce the energy, but without the negative repercussions for people, for example, in terms of spoiling the environment, spoiling their view, and so on. So I don't have an easy answer for you, because I think it's going to be very specific to each locality. But I do think we need to get more creative in how we address this issue. It doesn't just have to be hydro, it doesn't just have to be wind. If we find that we're facing a barrier in either one of those, there are other potential avenues that we can explore. I'm afraid beyond that I don't have an easy answer. The only other easy answer, I suppose, is that in China they don't have that problem. When they need hydropower in China, the village is moved. Please.
Yeah, following up on Joe's question, with Northern Pass in New Hampshire, and I'm sure you know this, there's an added complication. It's not simply are people worrying about the scenic beauty of the state versus cheap hydropower. It's also friction in Quebec itself, between Hydro-Quebec and the Cree community, and the cultural conflict that's been going there for 40-odd years. So it reaches out in all sorts of directions. Second thought that crosses my mind, there was a comment earlier on about corporate education. First word that crossed my mind when I heard that was advertising. And I'll give you an example. Over the past few years, we see more and more television ads with interracial couples being displayed as normative. Nobody seems to worry about them. My youngest niece has ancestry and life experience that draws on 4 continents, just as a case in point. The final thought that crosses my mind, you talked about optimism and how to get messages across to various constituencies. And West Virginia, all right, objective fact, coal is dying. But you've got ordinary people, don't talk to them about doing with less, because they're going to tell you, we're one of the poorest states in the country, and we are the most drug addicted. Ain't nothing in these mountains but despair. All we've got is coal. It's coal and dignity, or despair and fentanyl. What do you have to say to me? I'm entitled to a job with dignity. So the trick is how to couple that demand, which I submit is legitimate, with converting to a clean energy future. How do we pull that off? Because that's where a lot of the resistance is going to come from. You know, Trump got 69% in West Virginia. And in the Republican primary, right now in Virginia, the candidates are falling over each other, clinging to Trump and identifying with him. And that's among the forces that we're going to have to beat to move ahead, it seems to me.
So let me deal with each of those. I think they're all very, very important and deserving of solid answers for each of those components. And I should preface this by saying that I'm about to criticize our movement. But I'm a bought and paid member of our movement for 20 years. So when I criticize this movement, I'm criticizing myself. So let's deal first of all with the first issue you mentioned, the division between Hydro-Quebec and the Cree. I think one of the failings of our movement, the environment movement, is that we have spent our whole time trying to build a perfect world. You cannot build a perfect world. My PhD is on the issue of climate justice. And I followed as my model in that PhD a theorist called Amartya Sen. And he said a theory of justice isn't about creating a perfect world. It's about helping you avoid manifest injustices and helping you to make choices. Because that's what we're always faced with in the real world. If you talk to a CSO in a company, if you talk to a chief executive, if you talk to a president, a politician, a policymaker, there is no perfect world that they can deliver. What they can deliver is choices based on hard trade-offs. Right. So I often get into disputes with people in my community because, for example, last week I was talking to someone from the International Trade Union Confederation, and they said to me, we don't just want you to go to Walmart and all these American companies and tell them to reduce emissions. We want you to go to these companies and tell them that they must unionize right now and that they must involve these unions in the shaping of their climate policies. And I, of course, said to them, yes, I'm an Irish social democrat. I'm fully aligned with the idea of being unionized. My grandfather was one of the founders of the Irish trade union movement. But there's no way that I'm going to do that, because I'm not going to go to a company and ask them to do two impossible things at the same time. What I'm going to do is I'm going to focus on this particular outcome right now, which is critically important, and this other particular outcome we will come to at a later date once we've built a foundation and have something solid to build from. Now they're up in arms, and we're in the moment of difficulty trying to resolve how we will deal with their need for perfection with my need for progress. And I think that is a solid failure of the environment movement, that if you look back at domestic policy action on climate change in the United States, and if you understand why it took 25 years to get to the Paris Agreement, it's because we always try to load things with too many facets, and we stop ourselves from making progress. We are very good at shooting ourselves in the foot. So when it comes to this dispute in Canada, I am extremely sympathetic. But right now, I've got to focus on trying to get us accelerated to a low carbon economy, for all of the reasons I outlined earlier. Because there is a manifest injustice as opposed to an issue of inequality. And in my view, the manifest injustice needs to be avoided all the time, even if that means tolerating a certain degree of inequality in the system. The second issue that you raised, I think, is fundamental. When I turn on the television, and I'm going to be a little bit graphic here, so forgive me, but it's past the watershed. I was watching the Masters golf a couple of weeks ago, and in between the putts and the drives and everything else, when the commercials come on, somebody's trying to sell me a Mercedes C-Class, and then sometimes somebody's trying to sell me erectile dysfunction pills, and then somebody's trying to sell me financial service products, because they know who the demographic is who's watching that. If I turn on the NFL, it's not a Mercedes C-Class, it's a Dodge Ram truck and it's Budweiser beer. And they're not selling me a car by telling me this has the best gas and will get you from A to B. They're actually selling me independence. They're selling me freedom. They're selling me a philosophy of life. And what do we do in the environmental community? We sell people sacrifice. We sell people burden sharing. We sell people doom and gloom. We tell people the world is ending. We have no idea how to communicate. We have no idea how to advertise and market this issue. We have no idea how to create a vision of a better life as our tool. Instead, what we're trying to do is tell people, let's avoid this destruction. And that will never, never sell. So why we have not picked up on the best lessons of Madison Avenue is something that I think we really need to grapple with as a community. Because our opponents have. Our opponents really, really have. So for example, in Ireland recently, there was a constitutional referendum on gay marriage. And Ireland became the first country in the world to put in a constitutional provision on gay marriage. But they didn't call it gay marriage, they called it marriage equality. Because gay marriage, as a term, made it seem as if we're offering gay people rights above and beyond what everyone else is entitled to. Therefore they are entitled, and why should we back that entitlement? Whereas marriage equality simply means we're giving them the same rights that everybody else enjoys. What could possibly be wrong with that? So the way we brand things, the way we talk about things, the way we present things, actually has real world consequences. It's not just semantics. And I think we as a community need to grapple with that very, very substantially. Your final comment was?
West Virginia.
West Virginia. This is very interesting, yes. So I spent 10 days in West Virginia last year, and I lived in a community called Welch, which is in McLean County, which is actually the county in the United States that voted most heavily for Trump. It wasn't 69%, it was 76%. And I found a desolate environment. If you've ever seen those photographs or videotapes of Robert Kennedy visiting Appalachia in the 1960s, it's not much far advanced beyond that today. There was one young gentleman who hosted me, who was 24 years old, has 3 children of his own, recently adopted his sister's 3 children because she and her husband have both been imprisoned for opioid addiction. The local newspaper that you pick up at the gas station is actually just a series of mugshots of all the people who've been sent to prison over the course of the last month, most of whom have been sent to prison because of opioid addiction. It's a food desert, there's no fresh produce available, rampant unemployment, and rampant social decay of all sorts. They have a beautiful new school building, but they can't attract any teachers to come in and educate at the school because there's no housing, and of course nobody wants to live in that community. So there are huge, huge problems. The first thing I would say is that I learned while I was there that a piece of coal is not just a livelihood, it's actually masculinity. A piece of coal to one of those men is, I can feed my family, I am a man. If you take that piece of coal away from me, what am I? I can't even feed my family. It's emasculating for them to hear about coal, not just in terms of economic development, but in terms of cultural identity and identity as a human being. So I completely take your point that there needs to be a response. But I would say there needs to be creativity in that response. So let me give you an example of what I think creativity looks like. This may be a stupid idea, but perhaps you'll give me brownie points for at least being creative. There are 50,000 US troops currently based in South Korea. There are countless thousands of troops based in Japan. There are countless thousands of US troops based in Germany. Those troops will never be sent into action. They're not going to fight any war, because those locations, the types of war that will be fought there, will not be ground troops. So why not repatriate some of those troops? Why not repatriate some of those troops, for example, to a military base that is put in Welch, West Virginia? A military base that would have access to the port of Norfolk, Virginia, a military base that would have access to the Joint Air Base at Andrews, and why not combine that economic investment in that community by helping to locate the second Amazon headquarters 1 hour up the road, perhaps closer to the Ohio border, so that you create an economic development zone in this part of Appalachia, combining public investment and private investment, that could give jobs as an alternative to those coal jobs to those people, an opportunity as an alternative to coal to those people. Why aren't we doing that? Instead, what we're doing is we're saying your choice is food stamps or coal. There are choices far beyond food stamps and coal, if only we can be a little bit creative in our thinking. Please, and then I'll come over here.
Sort of building on what you've been saying, you'll see on radio and television the sound bites of the guy who says, I'm a coal miner, it's what I do, I can't wait to get down in the mine so I can feed my family. But that's not a universal attitude down there. When there was protest at the Brayton Point power plant, which was the largest coal-fired power plant, I believe, on the East Coast, women were up there saying, they took my grandfather, they took my father, they took my husband, and now they're coming for my sons. So they need choices, they need better choices, and to some extent they have been offered choices, retraining, which they have turned down because our president promised them the coal was coming back.
Thank you. I saw a hand, 2 hands over here. Let me deal with you first.
So it seems to me this is a kind of a money and information war that there's a Harvard researcher, Naomi Oreskes, who wrote Merchants of Doubt, and in this industry that takes money and they do PR for firms to instill doubt about science for various reasons, smoking and the link between smoking and cancer, asbestos, non-flammable chemicals, and now fossil fuels and climate change. And so the money it's kind of like marketing, convincing people there's not a problem, which helps the companies make short-term profits. But on the other side, there's not money, there's people that care, because they know there's damage happening and they have to speak up. But there's a lot of money on one side, and that's why they're so good at marketing and convincing people, on their side. On the other side, there's people that are volunteering and that have different careers but got into trying to do something because they know it's the right thing to do. So it doesn't seem like a fair fight. And so there's policies that can address a particular market failure, but as you have done this for so long, you must have thought, is the structure right? Should we have to keep going through these same battles trying to survive? Or is there something else that we should be working on so that we don't have to keep playing, whack-a-mole?
My simple answer to that is yes. My more complicated answer, again, has to be prefaced. So I've lived in the United States for 10 years, and my son is an American. So I think I have privileges to say some nice things and also to say some critical things. So here I go. I think the greatest thing, when I go back to Europe now, and I go back to visit my ailing parents often, I always know that the first thing I'm going to be asked is, what's going on over there? And how bad is it really? And last time I went home, as I was getting ready to board my flight at Newark Airport, there were all manner of people getting ready to fly down to Puerto Rico on their own dime to help fill the vacuum left behind by the federal government and rebuild the communities and homes of strangers. And what that says to me is that the greatest thing about the United States is volunteerism. The greatest thing about the United States is a willingness of individuals to step out of their own lives and help strangers. That is something truly unique, and that is something that I cherish about living in the United States. Now here's where I get to the critique. The structure in the United States, the political structure, is one of the most damaged I've seen in any industrialized country in the world. So for example, right now we have a special prosecutor examining whether or not Russia affected the last election. If you want to know who has damaged American democracy, it's Americans who damaged it, not the Russians. It's the Supreme Court ruling that overturned the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and that provided a mandate to state governments all around the country to close down polling booths in predominantly minority communities. It's the state legislatures right around the country who have gerrymandered their districts to such an extent that you do not have to fear a general election. You only have to fear a primary. And there's a 90% incumbency rate in the Congress in Washington, D.C., which means that there is no incentive for you to come to the middle. There is no incentive for you to work with people that disagree with you. There's only an incentive for you to go to the extremes, to appeal to the people who might primary you. Citizens United, one of the most, in my view, probably the most damaging Supreme Court ruling in history, which not only means that volunteers are at a disadvantage to the Koch brothers, who, by the way, provided $900 million of their own money in the last electoral cycle to support libertarian and extreme right viewpoints, which has been catalogued in a wonderful book called Dark Money. But it also means that elected representatives at the federal level have to spend half of every day fundraising instead of doing the people's business. And who are they going to work for? Well, if you look at the recent tax bill, David Brooks in the New York Times was talking on NPR, and he had a wonderful quote. He said this wasn't a base bill, this was a donor bill. So historically what would happen is you would appeal to your base. Now you don't have to appeal to your base anymore, you just have to appeal to your donors. 2 weeks ago, Scott Pruitt was coming under all manner of pressure for his first-class travel and his dining sets and his wanting to be whisked through Washington, D.C. in a police escort. And what was very interesting is that only 3 Republican senators went on record to defend Scott Pruitt. Marco Rubio, Ted Cruz, Rand Paul. What those 3 gentlemen have in common is that they're all young enough and ambitious enough to still need the Koch brothers' money and Sheldon Adelson's money the next time there's a vacancy at the top and they want to run for the top office. And they needed to come out and they needed to support the guy who is supported by the donors. So there is a dysfunction, a deep, deep, deep dysfunction. When you then get into voting habits, a deep, deep, deep dysfunction. When you get into the media, a deep, deep, deep dysfunction. Where do you go as an ordinary American in this country to just get facts as opposed to be spun? I don't know the answer to that. What I do know, however, is that I come from a culture where you have publicly funded elections. I come from a culture where you have very high voter turnout. I come from a culture where the education system is extremely robust. I was in a coffee shop here in Concord today, and on the tip jar it said, "We need your tips, we have student debt to pay." I have a PhD level education. I never had to pay a penny for a single hour of education from K all the way through to doctor in my entire life, because education is considered a human right. Healthcare is considered a human right. So, that's my very long answer. But my very short answer is, yes, the system here is rigged. Yes, the structure here is problematic. And that is why, for example, I mentioned on my slide that I'm worried about the federal courts, and I'm worried about the packing of those federal courts, because ultimately, I actually don't think we need another climate policy. I don't think we need another commitment to reduce emissions by X amount. I think what we actually have to do is tackle these structural deficits. And they're far harder, and they'll take much longer, and they require a level of education amongst the general populace that I frankly just don't think is there. And they require a degree of attention that I don't think people are currently investing.
Thank you very much.
I think you were next. Yes, please.
Yes, I did. As you were speaking, I was thinking about how change occurs from an activist standpoint. And one of my mentors once told me it takes the wise, the wealthy, and the willing to work, and the lowly and the holy, which basically the lowly and the holy means the boots on the ground. So I'm often thinking about who are those boots on the ground that can help initiate some of those changes like you're talking about right now in terms of the things that are deeply wrong. And I'm wondering about, what about faith-based communities? And also, what about activating what I consider underrepresented audiences, which I know underrepresented audiences, whether they're immigrants or refugees or poor or folks of minority or disenfranchised or disabled or elderly. And I know they have a bailiwick of issues, but often they don't participate just because they're not asked. But what are your thoughts about those folks that might want us to be thinking more about the moral implications, are faith-based, as well as all those other boots on the ground that might really want to participate, but we just haven't engaged them?
So the first thing I would say is I would highly recommend, if people are interested, a book called The Difficult I Will Do Today, The Impossible Will Take a Little While. And it's the book is called The Difficult I Will Do Today, The Impossible Will Take a Little While.
Okay.
The title of the book comes from a Billie Holiday lyric, and it's a book loaded with vignettes. Nelson Mandela has written a piece, and Václav Havel has written a piece, but there's also a piece in there from a woman working on a suicide hotline. And the basic premise of the book is that even when we're dealing with things that are urgent, we still have to retain patience and optimism, because that's what actually works in the end. Quite often social change comes as a consequence of incremental steps, as opposed to the major revolutionary strides. So that for me has been a very helpful book in calibrating my own approach to this issue, because if you think you can't win, and if you're constantly facing challenges and uphill battles like the ones we've been talking about, it's very difficult to retain momentum and positivity. I do believe that all of these different groups that you've spoken to are vital. The faith-based movement, I think, has particular resonance in the United States. Of course, 81% of evangelicals voted for Donald Trump, meaning they voted for his agenda beyond anything else. But I do think that, for example, the biggest and most important thing that I would set my mind to right now, if I possibly could, in the US, would be particularly mobilizing what I call influence champions that are more likely to resonate with conservatives. I think we spend too much time talking to each other. I don't think we need another Al Gore. I think we need the equivalent of Al Gore on the Republican Party, and we need the equivalent of Al Gore working for an evangelical community, irrespective of what it is. And we need, for example, people like the Waltons, because they're the type of, I think, constituency that can reach some of the undecided or some of the opponents. I also retain some optimism. For example, irrespective as to what you feel about this issue, it's clear to me that the students from Parkland have had an impact on the discourse. And it's clear to me that there's been a level of sophistication about what they've done. They didn't just come out and march, they went up to Tallahassee and demanded action at the state capitol. And when recently Laura Ingraham from Fox News began going after one of them, he also was very sophisticated in that, as a 17-year-old, he didn't just call her out for being abusive. He actually said, I want your companies that are sponsoring you to boycott you, and I want all of my followers to boycott those companies if they don't. And what happened next? Well, what happened next is that those companies started to boycott her, and she went, quote, on 1 week's leave. So these are young people who, historically in terms of their voting, and historically in terms of their willingness to use what I would call sophisticated approaches to change, has not really been evident, and suddenly there it is, it's quite evident. So yes, absolutely. I think minority populations, I think young people in particular. Tomorrow, for example, I'm going to speak at a high school in Portsmouth specifically because I want to get to them before they have a chance to vote.
Well done, thank you.
So let's see, there was a hand. Let's come to the back here and then I'll come over.
So many thoughts come through your talk, but I want to say, I think a key word for me that I'll go home with is choices. And I'm an educator and an artist, activist, liberal, but I've studied gesture a lot in my life. And I've come across this idea that we've been living in a time, so I'm a baby boomer, part Irish, but we've been living in a time where there's been the gesture of Mars and cutting and division. But we're moving into a time where this cooperation and harmony, and we do live on one planet together. Our children know this. Many generations marrying, so much traveling, everything with the internet. And so I take it as a big challenge now. I live in a small town, Hancock, and some of my really great friends have totally different political stances. But I just tried to now bring in this gesture of, you did that, bring it together. It just a kind word. I know that sounds so corny and old-fashioned, but I just think that the kindness and the conservation are things we can do. And, you know, I grew up in the public school system at UNH and everything. Masters, traveled a lot. But one thing that I see a huge lack in our country is that people don't talk about the hard subjects together. A lot of my European friends are much more, oh, no, I don't agree with you on that. You know, but in ours it's like, well, you know. So I think having these conversations, and what people have mentioned about courses coming into the Ivy League schools and the best colleges, I think we need to bring the choices and the conversations into every kindergarten through high school. Start talking, and you don't always have to agree, but we'll do what we can do together. So afterwards too, I don't want to piggyback too much on your whole talk, but we just joined a group called Mothers Out Front, and we are passing out postcards for Mother's Day, and we have really good manners about it. We are going to deliver to our governor our wish that he gets on board with the Paris Climate Club in person, just doing one thing at a time. And I'm only mentioning that because it's an example. It is really doable. And all around that comes conversation toward everything you've been speaking about. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I just want to echo something that you said, because one of the things that I've picked up over the years in international climate negotiations is the fact that diplomats are sent overseas to speak for their governments, but they're not sent overseas to listen for their governments. So I would often see conversations where a diplomat would show up to a meeting, speak, And then the moment they'd finish speaking, they'd turn to their BlackBerry and start looking at their BlackBerry and not even listen to the reply. And that really brought home to me the fact that one of the things we need to do is to change the dynamic of how we communicate with each other, so that we can provide that space for listening, for talking, for exchange. The other thing that I would want to say about the comment that you made is that I do feel in this country we are moving away from facts. I think it's perfectly acceptable to have philosophical differences about what you do with facts. So, for example, there may be a fact that there's inequality in this country, but your philosophy may be that you give money to the wealth creators so that they can create jobs to build social mobility, and my philosophy might be that we build a social safety net for the poor. They're perfectly legitimate and contestable differences based on a common set of shared facts. But in this country, we're moving to a point where facts are up for grabs and everything is opinion. Now, my father's a mechanic. I would never dream of going out to my dad and telling him this is how you fix a car, and he says, no, this is how you fix a car, and I say, well, I'm entitled to my opinion the same as you are, because he is an expert and I am not an expert. And in this country, I think we've got to get back, especially on these issues that have a scientific basis, we've got to get back to the notion of educating people about not just the fact, but the importance of living in a world that is rooted in facts and understanding those facts as we make our choices. I see you're on the stage, which means it's time for me to go.
Yes. So, yes, we'll be around just for a few minutes afterwards, but I wanted to, again, thank everybody for spending some time with us. Thank you very much. Present with us and I think engage in a really interesting and valuable conversation. So thank you very much.